I can start. Hello, everyone out there. Very pleased that you're joining us for this event today. We're going to talk about Latinos in the 2020 elections from several perspectives. We're going to talk about local perspectives. Hopefully, the panelist who's going to talk about that has not yet arrived. But we're also going to have state level perspectives, that is the state of Arizona, of course. And we're also going to have a national perspective offered. This is being sponsored by the Center for Latinos and American Politics Research in the School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University. And we're collaborating with a colloquium series within the School of Politics and Global Studies. We're going to have several panelists, and let me just very quickly tell you a little bit about them. And if they'd like to add something about their expertise that I may have overlooked, please do so as you start. The first person who's supposed to be talking but has not arrived yet is Eduardo Saenz, who's with the group Mi Familia Vota, and he will be talking about hopefully local Latino groups and organizing in the Phoenix area, but beyond as well. Then we will have Lisa Sanchez, who's a professor at the University of Arizona in the School of Government and Public Policy. She has done extensive research on Latino politics and participation, including having written about elections in Arizona. And so she has an extensive background and experience as well, and we're very pleased that she is here. Then she will be followed by Lisa Magana. Lisa Magana is in the School of Transborder Studies here at Arizona, and she has done a lot of commentary on Arizona politics. She teaches a course that focuses on Arizona and immigration, and so she will lend her insights and expertise. And we finally will have Louis Desipio, who's a professor of political science at University of California at Irvine. Louis has been writing about Latino politics and very well and very insightfully for a very, very long time. So he will bring not only a national perspective, but a historical perspective as well. And I think that those are all nice contributions. So the questions that I have asked them to consider is the following. What are the major issues or challenges facing Latino political mobilization to participate and vote in the 2020 elections? Does this year pose unique challenges? If so, how and why? All right. So we will then begin, because one of our other speakers is not here, we will start with Lisa Sanchez from the University of Arizona. Unmute.
And unmute. It's the Zoom error, right? There has to be one of those for every one of these. So I'm really pleased to be here this evening. Thank you, Rodney, for inviting me. So a little bit about my background that, maybe Rodney, to kind of expand on what Rodney has said. I look at Latinos somewhat nationally, and my dissertation in particular looked at what happens when you see rising Latino populations in different segments of the country. So when I say somewhat nationally, I mean, I look at them across the country, but within certain areas. So across states, between states or between districts. And one of my main findings is actually that as you see Latinos rise up in certain populations, in certain congressional districts, you actually see changes in the voting patterns of their members of Congress. So this is sort of a big push for kind of the electoral connection. So the idea that there's accountability in elections based on population demographics. And I think one of the most interesting pieces that comes out of this is happening right here in Arizona right now. So my research suggests that once you hit sort of a threshold of about 30% Latinos in your congressional district or state Senate district, the same kind of process happens. You actually start to see the kind of a decrease in polarized politics. So if it's been at a fever pitch in terms of conservative politics in Arizona, all of a sudden you start to see it turn more purple. And we're sitting right there right now. Arizona is now sitting at 31.7% Latinos in the state. And so you're starting to see that pendulum swing a little towards the middle. Whereas for decades, Arizona had been sort of a Republican stronghold. So, so I think Arizona is kind of selfishly the very, very interesting place to look at this election. One of the pieces I think that everybody is wondering is what will they do in terms of voting patterns. And so some polling data has suggested that they are very much supporting Joe Biden or plan to support Joe Biden in this election. A poll said something on the order of 65 to 65, 68, depending on who you listen to, say they're going to support Joe Biden, Latinos. But 18% say they're actually going to vote for Donald Trump. So that's to say that there are Latino Republicans. A colleague of mine at NAU and I are writing a book actually on Latino Republicans right now. So we're watching them very closely during this election in particular. The interesting thing too about Arizona, I think, is that I don't expect there to be a lot of disturbance in terms of voting online, voting through the mail. And that has to do with the history of Arizona with the permanent early voting list. So that kind of has enabled Arizonans and Latinos in particular to be really used to this kind of idea of voting via mail. And when you poll them, voters tend to say 63% of Latinos say they want to vote by mail. And that is very much tied to their concerns about contracting COVID at the polls. So not a lot of surprises in terms of Arizona Latinos in terms of what they're voting for. One thing I would say, however, is that there has been kind of a lack of attention in a lot of cases to Latino voters. So just watching the Mark Kelly, Martha McSally debate, there was very little attention on Latino Arizona voters. It was all about Arizona voters in general. You didn't hear the L word, Latinos, come up almost at all. And I think this is a problem, especially for Republicans who, are kind of fighting an uphill battle in the McSally race. So I think I'll stop there because I don't want to, wax poetic all night, and kind of hand it over to my colleagues who will say some more. Thanks.
Okay, that would be me. My name is Lisa Magana. And as Rodney mentioned, I'm a political scientist that studies immigration and Latino politics and the connection between the two. What I think would be helpful is we're talking about Latino politics, and I want to give an example about recently, and some of my students have already heard this, but recently I saw an article about Latinos in Florida and read, oh, Latinos support Trump and they don't support Biden. And so I looked into it a little bit more, and it turned out these were Venezuelans and Cubans. And the whole platform was that you don't want to vote for Biden because he's going to be a dictator just like from the countries that you came from. And then in another section in Florida, another county is very much a densely Puerto Rican community. And the outreach was, you don't want to vote for Trump because look at the terrible job he did in Puerto Rico, right? And then just recently in Miami, he did a presentation, Biden and Harris, and talked about immigration. So very different, these three groups when it comes to Latino political participation or how we define Latino politics. And so thinking about, I've been in Arizona for a very long time. I think we're unique in terms of the Latino vote for a variety of reasons. And I would suggest that we as a clear Latino constituency started in around the mid 90s. And here in Arizona, we're a little bit different because we saw a lot of, obviously, immigration, negative immigration rhetoric, negative immigration legislation. And so in the mid 1990s, it was national, but there was the idea that we wanted to create a law that anybody who's in the country illegally would be a felon, and then you could never get US citizenship. Started demonstrations across the country, but in Arizona started some of the first mobilization strategies targeted explicitly toward Latinos. And that set the stage for the beginning of what we're seeing today. So In Arizona, we had numerous draconian laws. So 97, there was this law called Operation Restoration, which was a deportation operation in Chandler. We had lots of legislation targeting Latinos. So for example, if you get arrested, you can't get bail. If you've lived here all your life, you still have to pay out-of-state tuition. When you go to vote, you have to show more identification because there's all these unlawful immigrants that are coming into Arizona to vote unlawfully. Sound familiar? And so in Arizona, we start to see again the growth of these Latino advocacy groups. And I will add to this, what is also unique to Latino politics in Arizona is that we have a very strong constituency of immigrants that cannot vote but are very political. And so, and we've seen elections where we've had, you know, fierce Daca advocates that walk door to door and say, listen, I can't vote, but we need you to support advocates that will believe in comprehensive immigration. And so there's that's also grown in Arizona. And then, of course, we had the very famous Joe Arpaio and 287G, right? The racial profiling also served to galvanize the Latino population. And then ultimately SB 1070. And this was, for those of you that don't know, that's a police officer can stop anybody that looks Latino and ask them what in fact is their status, which is woefully unconstitutional, found to in fact be racially profiling. But it set the stage. It went to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court, said you still can do it. We still have it in Arizona. But it set the stage for a lot of organizations that became very much pro-Latino, pro-immigration. So after SB 1070, and I think this has been really unique to Arizona, and it is this One Arizona. It's called One Arizona, and it's it's a big umbrella organization that funds these mini grassroots organizations that have been incredibly successful in terms of outreach to first-time voters. And they call them the new American voters, Latinos, women, African American, people that had never, ever thought about voting before. And so in the last 2012, 2016, mostly 2018, we keep seeing an increase the number of the Latino political participation, continuing as a result of this direct outreach. And the other thing I would add, so that's one of the reasons I think Arizona is really unique. And so you have a group of also very, people that were young, that grew up in a very politicized environment, right? These are kids that couldn't vote. They may have been in high school, that are now getting older and able to vote, right? And we're seeing them now for the first time, first election. See my dog right here. Say hi, Frank. He's making his appearance. So do you see for the very first time, these individuals that are, again, participating in electoral politics. And I will just add, we were talking about Latinos for Trump. What we're seeing, a couple things. So it used to be immigration was maybe third or first in terms of importance for Latinos overall. And now we're seeing that it's very much COVID's number one, not surprisingly, right? Because we're affected by COVID. Immigration is now ranked number 4 for Latinos in terms of politics. Discrimination by elected officials is an issue. And what we are seeing also are those Latinos for Trump are the evangelicals. That it's a big, kind of an, I would say a little outlier because it's not significant. I think 16% you had said, Lisa, seems consistent with what we're seeing. And these are certainly one issue voters, I would say, that this issue of right to life and right to choice is very important in terms of their participation in electoral politics. But we're gonna see, right? The state has changed a lot. It's getting older, the demographics from other states, people are getting older. I think we're gonna see another significant turnout. Andy's not here yet. Let's see, you know, I don't know if you guys heard this, but the voter registration has been, what is it now? October 23rd, right? The deadline was supposed to be Monday. You heard this, right? So the deadline to stop registration for voting was Monday. And Voto Latino has sued, and they just recently announced now that registration will be extended to October 23rd. I'm sure it'll be legally challenged, but it's incredible. We'll see. And this is explicitly because, Latinos were hit hard by COVID, may have been more anxious about going out and registering to vote. So I'm anticipating a record turnout in terms of this election. And I will stop there and let my colleague go next.
Well,
Yes.
thank you very much, Lisa, and also Rodney for inviting me. I appreciate it. I'm going to focus sort of on some national questions. And as Rodney says, there will be a little bit of a historical perspective here. Let me start with some good news, since I often in these presentations focus a little bit more on the negative. If you look at the last 20 years, Latinos have been the group that has most rapidly added to the pool of registered voters. About 38% of newly registered voters between 2000 and 2018 are Latino. For non-Hispanic whites, it's about 24%. So just think about that for the future, even if it doesn't play out necessarily in 2020. So this has led to a new phenomenon in 2020, and that is that there are more registered Latino voters than there are registered African-American voters. And I think has led the media in some cases to suggest that there will be more Latino voters than African-American voters. That's probably not the case. It would take a really dramatic increase in Latino voting for that to play out. But nevertheless, if we're thinking 2024, 2028, 2032, that's a very significant sort of change. To temper the good news, of course, African-Americans turn out at higher rates than do Latinos. In most elections, African-Americans turn out, or I'm sorry, most presidential elections, about 2/3 of African-Americans, maybe a little bit less, turn out. This will probably be a slightly higher year with Senator Harris on the ticket. Traditionally, Latinos turn out at slightly less than 50%. So, that gap in turnout means that more registered voters don't necessarily connect to the reality of more voters. Nevertheless, the Latino vote will increase by a couple of million over 2016, and that's that's nothing to sneeze at in a race that at least until recently looked like it might be very close. Why is there this lower than average turnout rate among Latino adults, Latino registered voters? Couple of possible explanations. The simplest one is that Latinos are less likely to be asked to vote. They're less likely to live in the battleground states, so that investment in mobilization is more absent in Latino communities. My own estimate, sort of based on what I think the battleground states are right now, using 2016 data, just about 24% of Latino registered voters live in battleground states, where for non-Hispanic whites and blacks, it's more like 33%. So, they're just less likely to be receive that investment of being asked. And this is particularly important for first-time voters, younger voters who are sort of less familiar with the process. There are some compositional characteristics. Latinos are slightly younger than the population as a whole, less formal education, they move a little bit more. So all of these things dampen participation in all groups. It's just that the effect is felt more regularly in Latino communities, reinforced by the fact that nobody is asking because they're less likely to live in the battleground states. Finally, and this connects to Lisa Sanchez's work, there aren't Latinos on the ballot at other levels at the same level that there are non-Hispanic whites or African Americans. Certainly one of the most interesting changes in certain congressional races over the last couple of cycles has been Latinos winning in plurality races, Latino plurality districts, as well as Latino majority districts, but there are relatively few Latinos elected from white majority districts. Again, and that's just one sort of example of fewer Latinos on the ballot. Just about 1% of elected officials nationally are Latino, obviously a much, much lower percentage than the Latino share of the population as a whole. So what's unique about 2020? To be charitable, President Trump isn't held in high regard by the Latino community, I think for good reason, starting with the trip down the escalator and through sort of repeated challenges to American identity. President Trump has not reached out in an affirmative way. He has reached out, which I'll get to in one way, but he generally, his message has been rather negative. And Latinos hear that. Some Latino decision polls recently asking about whether President Trump and the Republicans are doing a good job in reaching out to Latinos. 32% said that he and they don't care very much, and 44%, which is pretty remarkable, say he's openly hostile. I think you can interpret whether that's a reasonable reading or not. To me, it suggests 80% concern about President Trump is pretty high. It's comparable to 2016. Vice President Biden, I think, is more of an unknown quantity in many Latino communities. That same question about Biden and the Democrats, about 58% say that he and the Democrats are doing a good job. This is somewhat less than a similar question that was asked about Secretary Clinton in the 2016 race. So he's just a less known quantity. Enthusiasm is high. This is true of the electorate as a whole, but also in terms of Latino communities. Again, from Latino decisions, about 2/3 of Latinos report that they're more enthusiastic today, when the survey was asked, than they were about the 2016 election. About half of Latinos have been contacted by a party or a candidate for office so far. That number is creeping up, but it's a little on the low side. So I think we're seeing a consequence of COVID, that there has been less sort of individualized contact in 2020 than there has been in past elections. There's been some targeted outreach by the candidates. Senator Harris has done some visits in Florida to Latino communities, Cuban American communities, Puerto Rican communities. President Trump visited with Latino communities in Arizona a couple of weeks ago, got a lot of national attention to that. This, to me, is an example of what the Times columnist Michelle Cottle calls a ricochet pander. By reaching out to Latinos, he gives himself some credibility that may win some moderate white votes. I don't really think he's trying to affirmatively win a lot of Latino votes, but there's been some outreach, not as much as previous years. Some of that can be explained through the COVID. So where does the race stand right now? Well, the most recent Latino Decisions poll, and this is from our colleagues, but it's nationally regarded, has Biden at 68 nationally, Trump at 23, and about 8% undecided. That's an October 5th poll. That figure, though, masks some state-to-state differences. In California, for example, Vice President Biden is doing very well among Latinos, about 73 to 21 for Trump. In Florida, sort of a different story. This has been going back and forth, but at the time, that October 5th, this was the September 23rd poll, had Biden up just 52 to 39. So obviously considerable variation by state. Texas is a little closer to Florida. Arizona is a little closer to California. So where will Latino influence be felt? Well, you're living it. You're sitting in the middle of it. Latino turnout can drive a Biden victory. If Vice President Biden wins Arizona, it will be because of Latino votes. A Latino Decisions poll that was just released today has Trump +9 among white voters, and 64-29, Biden up 64-29 among Latinos. That explains why you have a very tight race, maybe with Biden a slight advantage. The Latino partisanship, I think, can influence the outcome in Florida. You get a higher turnout, Cuban Americans and Venezuelans in South Florida. You could have one outcome, which is either a narrow Trump victory. You have a strong turnout among Puerto Ricans and other Latinos in the I-4 corridor. That could explain a Biden victory, but there are many other movable parts in Florida voting, particularly elderly whites, that will probably be more important to outcomes. Number of states, if they're very, very close, and certainly we had that experience in 2016, Latino influence could be a part of the story if Latinos turn out at higher rates than they traditionally do. So Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, and North Carolina all have electorates that are between 3.5% and 4% Latino. So in a very close race, some claims can be made. We shouldn't overlook the fact that a number of states are now solidly, reliably Democrat because of Latino movement into the electorate and movement in and maintaining their role in the Democratic Party or perhaps growing it. So here, California, going back to the 1990s, what was a purple state is now reliably a Democratic state. New Mexico, you have to go back a little bit further, but a similar story. More recently, Virginia and Nevada, though in both of those states, Asian Americans play a role as well. So the Latino influence will be felt, though it's not often the cudgel that some people see, but more of an incremental movement into the electorate, which we've seen, that won't be felt sort of suddenly, as some people say. Texas is seen as a battleground. Having lived there, I'm a little bit more dubious, but certainly if the Democrats should win, that will be based on Latino votes and perhaps a surge in Latino votes in a number of competitive congressional races. I realize I'm probably stretching my time here, but just to suggest some subnational races that you might want to pay attention to. Obviously, your Senate race is key. That same Latino Decisions poll has Kelly and McSally even among whites, but Kelly way ahead, 54-33 among Latinos. That's why he has a significant lead in a number of the polls you're looking at. Colorado is another state with a weak Republican incumbent and a actually less strong Democratic challenger, but there again, Latino votes will be part of the Democratic victory coalition should it happen. In very close races, North Carolina, the two Georgia races, again, Latinos could be important, but it has to be very close. And to me, there'd have to be some evidence that they did something that we didn't expect them to do. Alaska, people say is competitive in the Senate, but there are no polls. So who knows? There's actually a significant Latino population up there. This list is relatively short, I think, compared to the list of competitive Senate races. And that says something about sort of the concentration of Latino communities. A number of congressional races. I'm not going to go through each of them. I just want to point out that there are 4 in Texas. The big district that goes from San Antonio to El Paso along the border has been represented by an African-American Republican, but before that it sort of went back and forth between Latino Democrats and Latino Republicans. Should that race generate some turnout, it could have some impact on the presidential race. And then suburban districts in Dallas, Houston, and Austin. Austin has very weird districts because of long story there. But in each case, you have, 25, 30% Latino, 25 or 30% of the electorates in each of those districts are Latino. Consequently, if a Democrat wins, it will be based in part on, or it'll be part on a coalition of Latinos and liberal whites. A few others I can talk about if you're interested, but Texas congressional races will be one of my foci on election night. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Louis. One of the things I'd like for the 3 panelists who are here to do is to see if they have any observations or comments on each other's comments. I myself have some questions, and we will be inviting questions from the audience out there in a little bit. But for the moment, do either of the 3 of you have additional questions or comments or observations about what the other person said? Lisa Magana?
Well, I don't know if it's necessarily, that was great, my colleagues, thank you. I was just thinking about immigration and how much has changed as a platform during this election, right? So remember Trump came here when he first announced, and because this was whole about, we're tough on immigration, and you don't see that in this election. And I think for the state, smartly so, has learned that when you're anti-immigration or immigrant, it's a black eye for the state, right? So the state lost lots of money when they looked with SB 1070. Smartly so, you don't see that again. And the only thing I've heard, I thought this was fascinating, is that regarding immigration, is that there's 2 more things, if I may, is that so President Trump said Biden's going to be really soft on immigration. And in fact, he's going to allow, I don't know, up to 700,000 refugees come into immigration. So conflating or putting unauthorized immigration with refugees, which is completely different. But people, okay, this guy's going to be soft on immigration, which I think is, fascinating. And then the other thing is that some studies that I have done, some research, is that Daca is really a fascinating agenda it's a tough game to play because the approval for Daca kids is really high. 70–80% of Americans support Daca. Their kids, they've been good people, right? They don't have any criminal record. They've gone to high school, maybe in the military, have very high support, but they have no power. And so it's kind of fun to watch Trump say, oh, these people are terrible criminals, gang members, but at the same time, we love our DACA kids. So and we've seen with the Biden campaign, smartly so, talking about the DACA recipients and doing something about DACA, because realizing that, again, that DACA polls very high. So just to think about how immigration, what a different campaign than 4 years ago when it comes to Latinos and immigration.
Now, I've noticed in Trump's, I don't call them stump speeches, I mean, since he sort of goes on, if you did sort of a word count, immigration and immigration-related issues are much diminished in 2020, even compared to 2018. And I don't know if that's just because his mind has sort of moved to other things, or he has other grievances that he wants to focus on. I'm sure some of it is that, or sort of a recognition that some of the red meat that he could throw to the audiences in 2016 and 2018, he hasn't lived up to. Not much more wall has been built. He could talk about lower numbers of legal immigrants, but that I don't know that how he energizes people around that. So he's diminished it. I did wonder, there was a caravan that started up from Honduras a week or two ago, suspiciously timed to fill into some potential campaign events. And then he got sick. So I don't know if there had been an uncoordinated effort there that he would have seized, or maybe still will in a couple of weeks, or not. But he really, for whatever reason, he's dampened his anti-immigrant rhetoric this cycle so far. Remember, Luis Bracamontes came out, I think, 10 days before the 18 election.
It's just not playing in Arizona anymore, immigration. And again, I think because it hurt the state, the governor has been much more, you haven't seen the same sort of rhetoric that you saw with Brewer. And so, yeah, we had the whole thing when he got the endorsement from Arpaio, right? That was a big deal. And of course, Brewer. And then he pardoned, remember that, Joe Arpaio, again, trying to pander to this base that was, anti-immigrant. But again, it's very different than 2016.
I also think a lot of this has to do with we've replaced one sort of boogeyman, which was immigration for Trump's supporters for COVID-19. So I think, this sort of the chilling effect is maybe not necessarily a strategy, I wonder, and maybe also has a lot to do with the fact that people aren't really thinking about it anymore. It's not at the top of the list, as you rightly pointed out. So I'm suspicious that it's a full strategy.
Yeah, it's not high anymore. I mean, you just can't make the case, right? So
yeah.
Okay, so we're going to invite questions from people out there. So please start submitting your questions, and I will do my best to handle them properly. I'm not great with technology, but I think I'll figure it out. But so please start submitting questions. But I guess I have maybe a question for each one of the panelists that I'd like to ask. One is to Lisa Sanchez, and that is, Lisa, what do you know, is there any research that has looked at the turnout rates of Latino Republicans versus Latino Democrats?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think. One of our issues with, I'll kind of show you my cards here. One of our issues with beginning this book project about Latino Republicans has been the ability to track Latino Republicans because so many states don't actually take in information and then disseminate information about Latino registration for either party. So they're not taking in race and ethnicity. There's a couple states that do, but by and large, most don't. So what we're left with is kind of these surveys, right, that have, built-in Latino oversamples. So for those of you who don't know the term oversample, just simply we're asking more Latinos so that we get a better representation of Latinos. So we do get some Latino Republicans, but just not very many. And so we're a little bit dubious about any sort of outcomes that we can draw from 12 Latino Republicans in a sample of 1,000 people. So one of the things that we're actually doing to address this very problem is working to get some money together. It all comes down to money always. Get some money together and put out a survey that is actually only looking at having an oversample of Latino Republicans. So not just Latinos, but also getting in the partisan piece to it as well. So I guess I would answer that question with there's a little bit of data out there, but I'm not sure I trust it, is what I would say.
Okay. Yeah, for what it's worth, we at the center are going to be involved in this large CMPS survey, which I'm sure all of you have heard about. And one of the things we're hoping and asking about is that they do an oversample of Latino Republicans, because again, they're a relatively unknown quantity in some respects. The quantity itself is not especially well known, but the attributes, the perspectives that lead them to that. Lisa had said that in Arizona, she believes that evangelicals play a large part of that. And that may well be the case in other parts of the country as well. I'm not sure, but I guess, that's kind of a hidden story out there that I think generates a lot of interest. Yes, Louis, did you want to comment on that? Or Lisa, go back to Lisa.
Add to that, okay, as you know, that in Arizona, most people live in Maricopa County, right?
60% of the state, yeah.
Right? I think it's like 4 million or more. And what is also significant is that it used to be predominant, like Lisa said, predominantly Republican in the state. And what the last two elections, it's a third Republican, a third Democratic, and now they call it other, but are essentially independents. And we're seeing that these are independents that are leading Republicans that are leading more moderate Democratic now. And so that is another been a shift. So it's been, it's not even that they're Latino Republicans, it might be Latinos that are, what we're seeing is that these moderates are just, Trump is just too much. And I'd rather be an independent. I can't, I may not want to be a Democrat, but it's too hard to not be a Republican, so I'm going to be an other. And so that's been a really significant shift in terms of partisanship in this state.
And I think, Lisa, you're right. That's been going on across the country as well. This kind of shift from the two-party system among Latinos to becoming more and more othering.
Okay, we're starting to get some questions coming in. Let me pose them to the panelists, and I'm not. In some cases, they're not really indicating who they'd like to have it. The question directed to, but I will ask the first question here. Is there a difference in party preferences among Latinos and Latinas? Are men more pro-Trump than women are?
Mm-hmm.
I see all of you shaking your heads yes. Could you offer a quick comment?
Again, I would refer you to Latino Decisions. They post the results of their weekly tracking poll online, and they've shown a pretty consistent gender difference with men somewhat more likely to favor Trump. Still a majority of men, obviously, the majority of Latino men supporting Biden, but a gap there. And this is a pattern I think that we also see in the non-Hispanic white community, where women, white women are much less likely to support the president than white men.
Suburban women, especially, right?
Yeah.
Well, how large is the gap between Latinos and Latinas? Is it
8 or
10%?
9, if I remember correctly.
Okay. And I know there tends to be a gap among Blacks as well. Blacks, as you all know, vote very, very heavily for Democrats, but there's actually, like, I can't recall the data exactly, but a 5 or 6% difference consistent in that. Okay. Okay, here's a question, a fairly long one, and it says California Governor Pete Wilson's support for Prop 187 in the 90s was, quote, credited with losing California to the Republican Party in the period since then. Will Trump's anti-immigrant, anti-Mexican rhetoric and maybe anti-China rhetoric among Asian Americans be similarly credited with making the GOP a minority party nationally in the future? or can the GOP pivot and still find ways to appeal to Latinos in the future?
The Republicans themselves took up this question in a report that they did after the Romney loss in 2012. They paid for, they solicited a report that came to be known as the autopsy. I forget the actual name of it, and it makes exactly that argument. I think the challenge, though, is that the results of the 2016 race showed that there remains an ability to mobilize parts of the non-Hispanic white population, both to move them out of long-term Democratic partisanship and to support a Republican candidate, and to get some new people into the electorate that can at least slow that process. This is, of course, reinforced by institutions like the Electoral College, which give disproportionate weight to some of the smaller states and dampen the voice of highly concentrated populations. So long-term demographics, yes, would certainly challenge the ability of Republicans without a major reshaping of themselves, and that'll be very hard after President Trump. But long-term demographic projections are always risky. My favorite, I'm Italian American, is that there was a demographer in around 1900 that looked at the 1900 census data and predicted that 60% of the country would be Italian American by 2000. He made the mistake of looking, at immigration 1890 to 1900. Be careful about long-term projections because politics intercedes.
So may I add to that, Louis? Oh, I'm sorry, Lisa, you want to go ahead?
No, you go ahead. I'll follow up.
Yeah, well, you're talking about this blueprint after the Romney loss, and we got shellacked, right? And what are we going to do to get these? One of the things are going to be not so tough on Latinos and draconian when it comes to immigration. So all this has been very short-sighted. But one of my favorite examples was right after this was the Gang of Eight proposal. What are we going to do with the 11 million unauthorized immigrants that are in the United States? And this was a big fight. And just put this in perspective. The politics of what do we do if we legalize these unauthorized immigrants? And then eventually these unauthorized immigrants that become legal permanent residents can become US citizens. So it was so polarized that they couldn't decide how to legalize these immigrants. In fact, the idea was, well, maybe we'll let them be legal. And then after 14, 15 years, we can maybe let them apply to become US citizens because we're so worried that most of these unlawful immigrants are Latino and Latinos are probably going to register as Democrats. And so the idea was after 15 years, these senators would no longer be in office, so it wouldn't hurt them. But I mean, that was just so intense about the idea that Latinos are going to, not only if they become US citizens, they're going to vote and they're going to become Democrats and they're going to kick out the Republicans. So yeah, very much all connected.
I also think I would add to both what Louis and Lisa have said, that Latinos the Republicans don't just have an immigration problem when it comes to Latinos. I think they also have a socioeconomic problem when it comes to Latinos. So yeah, I think the biggest, most pressing issue is the anti-Latino rhetoric. But when you're supporting policies that are sort of cutting into the bone of welfare policies, and a lot of these populations rely on these to survive day to day, I think it's also a really tough sell. And so what are they left with? They're left with more of these sort of morality politics that are, I don't want to say that they're not important, but I think if you're thinking kind of in terms of your hierarchy of needs, your Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you're going to need to eat first. You need to meet these needs first. And then a lot of Latinos start to think, okay, well, I have to put this abortion question on the back burner because I have to survive. So even though there might be some of these latent, maybe more conservative ideals that are morality politics or more, surrounding these issues, they still are not they're not at the top of the agenda, and they're not at top of the agenda in terms of day-to-day life for these individuals. So it's it's a difficult sell kind of all around.
Well, Lisa, a great example is COVID relief, right? How many Latinos frontline, right? Workers, and how wouldn't this be great if Republicans gave them some assistance? Wouldn't that be politically smart for them?
Yeah. Well, and then Latinos and Blacks are dying at higher rates. They're more likely to catch it.
Right.
I mean, all of these things are problems that are not really being addressed. So it's not just immigration. It's all the way down, A through Z.
Okay, thank you. There's another question we received is a kind of a follow-up between the one about men versus women, and that is, what about between older Latinos versus younger Latinos? Are older more Republican or not? Do we know that? Do we know how the age breakdown
I
is?
would bet, I'm guessing here, and I have a poll that I could look at in a moment, but I would bet that the younger are less likely to be partisan, meaning that they say they're other, even if they reliably vote one way or the other, just because that's true of young people generally. But I guess I'd make a point about political socialization here, that today's younger voters are socialized to politics in an environment, sort of primed by President Trump. And that is, I would imagine, pushing most Latino young adults to vote Democratic, where a generation before, if they'd been primed by President Bush, they might have been more open to a Republican message. As I say, that was all conjecture.
And I would say regionally, so a state that's predominantly Republican, you tend to, align with that party. So Texas and Latino Republicans, or say California, you're going to have more Democratic constituents, right? California. So I think it depends, which is why Arizona is so interesting right now. A predominantly Republican state that we're seeing shifting demographically with Latinos.
Certainly, we've also seen some evidence. So I think part of what complicates that question, that probably gives all of us a little bit of a pause, is that in terms of Latino Republicans, you also have some intersections with age, with generational status in the United States. So, you're having older generations more likely to be immigrant. As we increase in the population, we're more likely to be native born. So those also sort of complicate that, and country of origin complicates that within the generational status. But we have seen in, like, as Lisa said, in reliably Republican states like Cuban Latinos in Florida, as we increase generation in the United States, Latino Cubans are, younger Latino Cubans are becoming more and more liberal, slightly more liberal. So that is not to say they are Democrats, but we're starting to see sort of very slow incremental shifts away from kind of this reliable Republican Cubans. So I think that's one place I would look.
Okay. Here's another question. It's a little bit long, so please listen carefully, panelists. As of yesterday, states that report voter registration data by party, 1.2 million Democrats have returned mail-in ballots compared with just over 505,000 Republicans. Since we have a federal extension on voter registration in Arizona until October 23rd, which Lisa mentioned, how long will it be before we can access and analyze this initial data by ethnicity for the final fight for votes? Any thoughts?
Is that in Arizona?
Yeah.
So we don't, because registration ethnicity is not tallied in terms of registration data by the state of Arizona.
We have exit polling, but yeah, we don't really know.
Okay.
I mean, we guess we know that more Democrats generally are going to vote more by mail, right, than in person. That seems to be consistent, right, with the research is showing. I don't know.
Okay. Another question. Do you think if there is more Latino political representation, would that make Latinos lean more Republican? I assume that means that if there are more representation of Latino Republicans, would that make Latinos lean more Republican?
Yes. The local office holder puts a face on the party. And I think that's one of the reasons that California, for example, has a higher bias towards the Democrats. It's just all the local elected officials, Latino elected officials, almost all of them, are Democrats. To the degree that the Republicans wanted to make a longer term investment, it would be very wise to find competitive seats and encourage Latino candidates. They've done that very well in South Florida, and perhaps other parts of the country. But
yeah, I would add New Mexico has been very successful, right? I don't know though, because you have Ted Cruz and you have Marco Rubio, and I I think partisanship is certainly really important. I don't know if it's necessarily you just vote for somebody because they're the same ethnicity. So I've been asked that question. Well, what about, Marco Rubio? And it's like, well, no, doesn't, just because he's a Latino, right?
That's why I focused on local, I mean, really local elected officials. So, obviously, if you're running statewide in Texas, you're not making a very ethnically specific kind of, you're not sending that message. But, if you're the local city council person and you're actually connected to that community and you're a Republican, that has more, I think, more of an impact on sort of the, people coming into the process. It's not going to change things dramatically, but it would put a more human face on the Republican Party, which they, in many states don't have now among Latinos.
Can I add to that? So it's interesting. So you're saying local, Louis, which I absolutely agree. And then how many times have you heard, oh, this guy has sold out as he moved up, right? So it's, right, Lisa? And so it's much easier, right, Louis, right, Rodney? It's much easier to be sort of explicitly Latino, but of course, when you move into the congressional or Senate level, it can't be that explicit because you're obviously representing a much larger constituency. So that's a really good question.
Actually, that question and your responses is a nice segue to the next question.
I knew that.
It says, outside of the presidential race, what has been the general state in Arizona and national anti-Latino, Latino immigration sentiment in down ballot races? Has there been significant reduction in down ballot races around issues of immigration?
Lisa, you want to answer that?
I mean, I would say yes. I would say somewhat. I don't know. I mean, you still hear in most of these races, there still has to be you still have to take a stance on immigration in a big way. I think it's just expected now. So it's entered kind of the national agenda in a really big way where it's going to stick around for a while. I was actually going to defer to you, Lisa, about immigration in that way.
I think again, it's not as strong as it used to be. And remember, Arizona is the first in the country to actually recall the head of the state Senate, Russell Pierce, who wrote SB 1070. And, we have a couple still state senators that you might hear little rumblings about, but I feel like, Lisa, it's a very different climate now, and in terms of the lower level, in terms of immigration. I don't know. That's just my sense.
I mean, certainly there's a lot of policy making still going on at the state level. So I do some work in that area. And there was a policy explosion 2005, 2012 in state immigration policies. All of a sudden the states figured out, wow, we can pass these laws and kind of just bypass the federal gridlock altogether. And that's why we saw this explosion of things like SB 1070. Interestingly though, the one thing I think that's underappreciated about that period is we gave a lot of attention to the really negative immigration laws at the time, but there were actually more beneficial immigration laws, so laws that were beneficial to immigrants, passed at the state level during the same period. So in a lot of cases, Arizona was passing SB 1070, which was really sort of a big deal, right? It's, show your papers law. But at the same time, they were, adding in other ways to the welfare benefits that Arizona individuals who are immigrants could receive. So it's kind of like the weird situation of giving with one hand and taking with another. So certainly there is still movement on policy, which means that there's still kind of an expectation surrounding these local candidates having an opinion, but probably not in the same way as sort of 2016 under Trump candidacy, I guess.
My take.
Let me ask a question. I'm sorry, Louis, you were going, please go ahead.
I was going to say, thinking back, as far as 2010, each year there was somebody running, a senator running for something or a member of Congress running for something, and would use a sort of vitriolically anti-immigrant ad, and it would get a lot of national attention. It probably brought in money. It wasn't necessarily to generate votes. We haven't seen one of those yet so far in 2020. And I think part of it is that President Trump sort of takes the oxygen out of a lot of these other races. There just isn't enough time to pay a lot of attention to them. The other is that COVID is changing the way we campaign, and obviously both of those are sort of idiosyncratic to 2020. So I would suspect that we will see a return to some anti-immigrant messaging in 22 and 24 going forward, because it works for that Republican base.
Okay, so I will add, and I think, Louis, you're the one that told me this years ago, is let's see, when we're really going to see changes in Latino politics is after the 2020 census comes out and we do some redistricting, right?
I mean, counting on having an accurate census.
Yeah, I have a question. Actually, it's something that Louis had mentioned, and I'd like his thoughts, but also Lisa and Lisa. And that is, you mentioned, Louis, that some recent surveys indicate that, you indicated the numbers of Biden versus Trump, but you also mentioned Kelly versus McSally, and the Latino lean in that is significantly less, if I heard you correctly. 54-33 versus 68 something versus 20 or so in the presidential race. Do any of you have a sense of why there is that difference? Because if we think party matters a great deal, which we do, there is still, if I'm subtracting correctly, there seems to be quite a difference. Do anybody have some thoughts or explanation about that?
I will say, and you guys, I think McSally is running a really bad campaign. If you've seen the commercials, she's talking about Mark Kelly and his connections to China. And I just don't see any real connection with voters in Arizona, not in the less Latino voters. And I think remember, she lost to Sinema. And Sinema, I think Mark Kelly's an even better candidate than Sinema ever was. And so you're just seeing, and let me just say real quick, going back to that 1/3 other Republicans and Democratic, right? In terms of registration, Mark Kelly is that perfect kind of candidate that's a moderate Republican, moderate Democrat that Republicans and others can fall behind. So I don't think it's partisanship here. I think that she's just, I don't know if you saw the debate last night, but, they asked Sally, right? Yeah, if she still aligned with Trump, and she couldn't come out and say, yes, I'm still very much a supporter of Trump. So I think Ronnie, it's just not a very good campaign. My 2 cents.
But she's actually closer to Kelly than Trump is to Biden. And that's what I'm asking, is that what would explain why Kelly would have a smaller lead over McSally than Biden would have over Trump?
Could it be as simple as name recognition? Because she's run twice statewide in the last 2 years, as well as running in that congressional district, which is a Latino concentration district in the state. So you all know from living there, but is Kelly running any Latino-focused advertising, Spanish language advertising?
Yes, but Rodney, he's way ahead of McSally. I don't know if you said that or you missed that.
No, but we're talking about within the Latino population. The difference of Latino support for Kelly versus McSally compared to Biden versus Trump.
Oh yeah, I see what you're saying.
By some definition, I might have thought that it would be a larger margin for Kelly, but I think Louis poses an important point, and that is name recognition, having run the state before. And it is interesting, both of them have a military kind of background that both of them really highlight a lot. Particularly more recently, McSally has had these advertisements where she's walking out in her fighter pilot jumpsuit and holds a helmet as she's walking out, and it really is making an appeal. But of course Kelly has the military background as well, which is kind of interesting. Actually, just to underscore the point that we know that Arizona is going to be very close. Is that Biden was here today. I don't know if you knew that, Louis, but Biden was in Phoenix today, and Trump has been here 3, 4, 5 times in 2020. And his last visit was to the Latinos for Trump event. So it's clear that they see that Arizona as important, and if they can win some additional Latino votes here and there. And it's interesting though, Lisa, both of the Lisas, but is that the kind of the understanding that I saw is that some people were talking about Trump not so much in terms of religious evangelical kind of orientation, but it's like, oh, the entrepreneurial businessman, that the Chamber of Commerce kind of orientation or whatever that you hear some people talk about. And again, maybe especially Lisa Sanchez, who's doing this work on Latino Republicans, might have some thoughts about that. When I get asked that question about what draws Latinos to Trump, and it seems to me that there may be different reasons for different people. So evangelical religious stuff for some, a kind of business orientation, hard work, self-responsibility, etc. Although Latino Democrats believe in that as well, but it's kind of the way it's framed and the extent to which it seems to resonate. But if either or both or any three of you could kind of elaborate upon that based on anything or have some insight upon.
Yeah, so I would say there's a couple things that kind of generally that we find generally are drawing Latinos to the Republican Party, despite sort of these anti-rhetoric by the Republican Party. Certainly, we know national origin helps. So if you are from Mexico, probably you're not going to be a Latino Republican. But if you're from Cuba and possibly at some level at the margins, Puerto Rican, you might be a Latino Republican. We also know that things like weak pan-ethnic identity. So pan-ethnic identity is just a fancy word for saying Latino, right? So we mashed all of these 22 subgroups that make up the Latino identity into one. And so if you feel sort of weakly related to that identity, you're more likely to be to call yourself a Republican and a Latino. There's also like gender dynamics that we've talked a little bit about. So Latino men are more likely to be Republican than Latino women. And that actually goes a little deeper than just kind of raw partisanship. There's also sort of an ideological connection there too. So like in terms of immigration policies, Latino women are a lot more kind of expansive even than Latino men. So they're more supportive of having undocumented immigrants become citizens and a path to citizenship, and sort of more excited about that than Latino men. You see a little bit more about kind of the security aspect among Latino men. Beyond that, I mean, obviously there's pieces of border state and generation and age and all these things that we know affect partisanship otherwise. But the interesting thing about Latino Republicans, and this is why we're actually writing this, is that there's not a lot of great wisdom about saying, okay, this is the smoking gun. This is when you're a Latino Republican, except for the kind of this idea that you're Cuban. And so this is kind of what we're looking for. We haven't really come up, we're still kind of in the early stages of this. So we're still looking for this smoking gun because, 18% of Arizona voters say they're voting for Trump, who are Latino. So obviously there's something there. And I do think the economic piece is a good one. So we know that Latinos are highly involved in the market for starting small businesses. So in particular, Latinas have a huge amount of small businesses. They had one of the biggest increases of new small businesses between 2018 and 2019. So definitely kind of this idea that the Republican Party is kind of the protector of small business, I think maybe rings true, especially if you're surrounded in the context of Arizona that's kind of more red. So I certainly think these things play in, but I guess the short answer is there's no easy answer in my estimation.
Okay. I mean, it seems to me it might be kind of an accumulation of those various kinds of factors.
Absolutely.
Let me just say something. Someone corrected me. Thank you, Kenneth Klein, who told me that McSally and Kelly are both from Tucson. So that's something that they share, and so I guess I overlooked that. So thank you for bringing that to my attention. One more question, and I guess I will make this the last question. And the person who sends it acknowledges that it's a difficult question. It may be a hard question to answer, particularly because of COVID and the economy overshadowing everything. But does the increased participation and influence by Latinos that we see in this election, might it create any realistic possibility for comprehensive immigration reform in the short term if Biden were to win?
I would say absolutely yes. And if the Senate shifts and we get a majority in the Senate and obviously Congress and then the Democratic executive, absolutely. I think so. And it came very close in 2000, was it 12?
13.
Lewis? 13. But it was the conservative part of the Republican Party that said any sort of legalization for unauthorized immigrants, it's too much. And so that's why you saw McCain, you saw Marco Rubio, and you saw Ted Cruz saying, I would not support this sort of legislation again because it's too liberal. And so I think if we have a majority, I think absolutely comprehensive immigration. And I think the first will be toward Daca kids. I think that will be the first and foremost, most important, or the first legislation. Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm confident it'll be the first legislation, because I think the way to do it is comprehensive as opposed to the piecemeal. I mean, President Biden could issue executive orders that would protect the DACA recipients while Congress is acting. But the holdup in the past has always been the House of Representatives. In 2006 and 2013, all of the projections had the Democrats holding on to the House, whatever you believe about the Senate and the presidency. So you could peel off a couple of Republican votes, and it'll have to have some pieces that are probably reprehensible to many in the immigrant advocacy community, and maybe a national ID card. I mean, there will be pieces there that are truly a compromise. But yeah, the Republicans want to put it behind them.
Agreed. Yeah, I think, definitely under unified government, I think it's possible, but I agree with Lewis in saying it may be a lot like kind of the Obamacare process, right? So you end up with maybe something that's not quite as comprehensive as you might hope, but maybe some movement would be what I would say.
Okay, this will be the last question. Is outreach to Latina voters exclusively managed by Latinos? Is there much participation by others? What do we know about that?
Well, both of the parties have Latino outreach efforts, and the Republican one has traditionally been richer. It's probably been financially richer, but it survives between election cycles. So no, the candidates are doing some modest outreach to Latino communities in the battleground states, but that's always the challenge, that Latinos tend not to live in the battleground states, so they get less of that. The best model is Obama 08, where, if you were Latino in North Carolina in 2008, you got lots of outreach from the Democrats and from Obama.
I don't think I agree, my dear friend and colleague, Lewis. I think what's shifted now, it is not so much partisan, it's these organizations, right, that are doing specific Latino outreach, like I was talking about. So here in Arizona, right, Lisa, we have Lucha, we have Puente, we have Vota Latino. We've got a lot of these very specific that I think that are, by the way, being funded through partisanship, being funded through parties. So I don't know if it's explicitly the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, but definitely there's explicit Hispandering. You've heard that term, but I would say that it's much smaller. You've ever heard that, Lisa? Yeah, it's much smaller. Hispandering at I think coming through these organizations. Definitely seeing that in Arizona.
We also know, so I saw some recent work, it's kind of new, from, I think it's out of Latino Decisions actually, and maybe they haven't published it yet, so hopefully I'm not stepping on their toes, but I'm pushing it. That Latinos tend to be kind of ignored mobilization-wise between presidential election cycles, and so something along the line of Latinos actually are not contacted at all in the election cycle until something like 42 or 45 days before. So it's kind of like a little bit too late. So I think there's a problem on both sides of Latino mobilization. As you get closer, you're more likely to be mobilized, I think, but not enough.
I agree, absolutely.
Okay, thank you all very much. I appreciate Louis, Lisa, and all of you who participated and listened to the presentation. I hope it was enlightening and interesting to you. And again, thank you all very much for being here, and we'll have lots of other events through the center that we hope you will be interested in and involved in.